We're going to start this morning with Forrest Travis, and do so because he knows more about the stock market and particularly the GameStop issue than I, by far. And that'll be about 10 or 15 minutes, and after Forrest, I'll come back with the rest of the day. Forrest, you ready?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I just want to refer to my board here. GameStop. Does anybody know what GameStop is? Has anybody had any executive or heard any executive of GameStop speak about it? What's happened in the last several days? Does anybody know when it started? Do you know how many stores they have? They've got 5,500 stores in 14 countries, mainly selling out of brick and mortar stores. And I think this thing started relatively peacefully with a couple of guys thought it was underpriced and started buying it because it's cheap. And they thought maybe that it might have some potential to go to electronic distribution as opposed to bricks and mortar stores. But in the process, one of the Chewy, which is a online pet food supplier company, one of the founders was an early investor, and a lot of people thought, that's pretty exciting. He might take this thing to wider distribution quicker at lower cost, and this thing could be worth a lot more money. And they started driving it up. Reddit, who was a sponsor of a firm called Wall Street Beats, which is a forum of investors, both pros and rookies, as I call them. Some of them are sub-rookies. I actually looked at that website last night just to see how crazy they were, and they're insane. They really are. Some of them is so just insane you just can't believe. They basically feel like anybody that sells his shares, when they want it to go up, is some kind of mongrel of some sort. But anyway, you've got these. You got one player here, and then you got Robinhood that was a broker-dealer that accommodated most of these people because they traded at no cost. No obvious cost is a better way of saying it. And Robinhood is a typical broker-dealer. They both transact for clients, but they also deal in securities themselves as a principal. That's why the term broker-dealer is involved. The investors, as I say, were pros and rookies. And they were both long and short. And long means you own it. Short means you sold it. And you can short a stock in the stock market if you can borrow the shares from somebody else. And there's a business in the market, it's a very legal, ethical thing, where you can borrow shares, sell them short, and you just have to replace the shares by buying them back at some point. But one thing about being a short is you have unlimited risk, where if you buy a stock, it may go to zero, but it's not going to go to sub-zero. Well, if you shorted GameStop at $10, for example, and it went to 400, which it did, you could lose $390 a share or more. If it went to 1,000, you'd have lost more if you kept owning it. But it forces the short sellers to come back into the market and start buying, and that's what drove it up the frenzy. And the rookies piled on and says, we got them on the run, let's pour it on. And they kept buying shares and drove the market crazy. I'm sure somewhere along the line the GameStop executives thought, let's sell them the whole company. Because many people think that the stock probably is worth, I've heard $10, $15, some people as high as $50. And this morning it was traded a few minutes ago on my iPhone at $66 a share. Yesterday it was down 42% and closed at $53. So the bulls, so to speak, are back at it this morning trying to drive back to 400, which it probably will never do, is my bet. There have been a lot of comments that have been made from almost everybody alive. And I'll make a few to add to it that don't make much more sense than theirs. Some of them are really laughable, particularly the political commentary from both Republicans and Democrats. And y'all know I'm a Republican, and I hate to admit there's some stupid ones, but one of the brightest Republicans is a senator, and I won't name him, but you can read it in the press and find out. But he is a bright guy in legal matters. One of his Harvard professors said he's the best student he ever had. He made some inane comments about it, and Maxine Waters has made some other comments that just make absolutely no sense. And you've had commentators like Elon Musk, who loves the sound of his voice just like I do, and others that I think are pretty funny, including Mark Cuban, who's a billionaire that owns the Dallas Mavericks basketball team. But most of those comments really are wrong. They don't make any sense, and they can hurt people that listen to them. Musk encouraged people to stay in the stock. Cuban said he thought that it was wonderful if people were participating in the market. Well, it is, but it's a real business, and people get hurt, and people have been hurt. And I would tell you that my predictions going forward, and they're real simple. I think Yellen is having a meeting, I understand, sometime in this week or so, and she's going to have a public forum where she can discuss whether the market needs more regulation. My bet is it'll be some, and it'll probably be worthless or hurtful. But I also would predict to you that because of the profits that have been made, and as an indication, the market on GameStop is up $13 this morning. You will have people that will drive other securities to crazy numbers just because of the attractiveness of the people that have gotten a lot of publicity. So invest a little hedge fund in New York, invested a few bucks, and kept adding to the process. They started at $10. It went to 400. They cashed out and made $700 million. It was reported on the front page of the Journal this week. An MIT student had 500 bucks. He heard about it, got on the website. Probably a smart guy if he's at MIT. And he made a couple $100,000 that he's going to use to pay for his graduate school. And then you hear other reports where a guy paid off his student loans, another guy paid off his mortgage on his home. So there are going to be a lot of attractive things you could do, or appear to be attractive. I looked at the most active stocks yesterday, and there were 10 of them. 4 of them were less than $1. And you could pick any one of them, and you could get a cast of characters like these rookies on Wall Street Bets, and they could do it all over again. And as you know, there were other companies besides GameStop. AMC was one. There were several others, BlackBerry and others. It will happen over and over again, and people get hurt, people make money. And I would argue that even though the Wall Street Bet characters, they are characters. If you look at that website, you'll agree with me. But those guys will do this over and over again until they just either run out of money or brains, if they had any. So that's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. My wife said that's 8 minutes. I'm going to quit. I'll be glad to answer any questions I can.
But
hold on for the microphones. We have 2 microphones for the new people. One on this side, one on this side.
Are you the microphone?
Can you use that mic now?
Or there already is a law. If one company does what this group has done, it's against the SEC rules. In other words, if one company buys the stock and then drives it up by a bunch of buys, that's illegal, and you can get fined and.
Well, if the company does it,
Yeah.
absolutely. I'm just suggesting when it was at $400.
No, I
the
know.
company
It was a comment to add on to what you said. That these are people doing it,
Right.
but if it's concentrated in one company, it already is
Oh,
illegal.
that's illegal. It's ridiculous.
Right.
They'd lock you up. I agree.
Thank you.
so what regulation is proposed?
So what regulations would Yellen propose?
I haven't heard any suggestion from her. I think she's just responding to political pressure to do something. Doing something in Washington is some of the most frightening words on earth. Any others? Y'all have tested my knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Over there, as far as one more.
Okay, Forrest, what do you think, having seen what's going up today of those dollar stocks, what's the next GameStop? Which one it looks like the next GameStop?
Mary Jean, there's one of them I think will attract a lot of interest. It's called Naked.
What? I couldn't hear.
There's one of those stocks, and I don't know whether it was on that list yesterday, but it's been on the list several times recently. It's called Naked. I imagine that'll attract a lot of interest. Naked.
Naked.
Any others? Thank you.
Thank you, Forrest. Thank you very much.
Naked. That's a stock I'll buy. Thank you very much. That is something I'd like to do more often. On different topics and from different time to time, I think it'd make some sense for us to open. There are two other things I'd like to suggest we do, and I will do the work behind putting those together as soon as possible. One is to have a dialogue between two people, one taking a more liberal position, the other a more progressive position. And let them dialogue and also answer questions from the floor. I've seen that happen a lot at the Council on Foreign Relations and other venues, and it's a good way to get a conversation out. A second thing, Charlie Goldsmith talked with me about the other day, and it's something we've both seen, called table talk. At some of the meetings I've gone to that have been particularly useful, large groups of people coming together, the format is for there to be a 5-minute, and really a short 5-minute opening speech. And then the conference or the meeting goes back to tables. And the tables are typically round tables of 8 to 10. And at each table there'll be a reporter or a note taker. The table will elect possibly a spokesman. And each table must elect a spokesman. And they will attempt to answer a handful of questions. The ones I've been to were interesting. One question was, what can you personally do as an individual about the issue, whatever that issue might be? The second is, what can your organization, your corporation or your group or club or whatever, what can that organization do about the issue? And the third, what public policy should be implemented for that issue? At one of the meetings I was at on climate change, those three questions produced answers to the first questions. Well, I'll change my light bulbs, or I'll buy a Prius, or I'll better insulate my house. Those are things I can do that would conceivably do something to conserve energy. And as far as the corporate step, well, if one is a senior officer in a corporation, I'll make suggestions and put pressure on our company to do similar kinds of things on a company scale. Or perhaps I'll have my company convert from gas-fired vehicles to hybrids or electric plug hybrids or all-electric vehicles. And then internationally, anything from changing limits or adjusting limits or something else. In other words, those three questions do produce answers at the tables, and the table talk spokesman then goes up from all of the tables, goes up and they report on what the tables have talked about. I think we're of a large enough size, we're now probably 35 in here right now, that we could seat, 5 tables of 6? At Harvard math, there's 6 tables of 6 in a lot of schools. Charlie. Very for us. Charles?
Yeah, one of the purposes of this is to get into a smaller group. I would probably say 5 or 6, but that's, where a person would feel a little bit more comfortable participating in the discussion rather than getting up in front of a group of people. I've found this to be the case where you can talk with each other for 5 or 6 people, and there's Bob said, then you feed back the information. We found that we get greater participation, and it is in a friendly atmosphere, and people feel good about having the opportunity to talk.
Yeah, I think it's been very productive where I've used it before, and we might start that even as early as next week. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, and then, because that's easier to do than finding a co-culprit like Forrest to sit in front. Let's move into a couple of different topics. How many of you know where the town of Mukalla is located? Don't all speak at once. Jacques? Mukalla. Ocala is in Florida. Mukalla. Mukalla. Popular town, resort town, southern tip of Yemen. Mukalla is the headquarters of Al Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, or ACAP, some would call it. And I bring this up because recently, among his foreign policy initiatives, President Biden stopped our support, U.S. support, for any offensive weapons in the Yemen civil war. Why does it matter? What is the war? Have any of you been following that as a topic? I think it deserves just a few minutes because it reminds me at least of an era I had hoped was long past, when there were proxy wars around the world between the Soviets and the United States. The civil war in Yemen actually was a proxy war between Russia and the West, where the Russians had their guerrillas and we had our guerrillas, and we supplied them guns, and the happiest people on the planet were those who produced and sold guns. And I don't think many others benefited. I saw it in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, where I was at the time working, but there are states throughout Africa where the same thing was going on, and in Asia. And it was this, the real war wasn't between two groups of people in that country, but rather these two colossal giants who were trying to pick a fight, and they sent those people off to fight. In Yemen, the conflict ended initially at the end of the Cold War, when the communist, the Soviet Union dissolved in 1989, 1990. And a man named Ali Abdullah Saleh, S-A-L-E-H, became the head of state of Yemen. And that lasted peacefully for about 5 years, and then the proxy war concept started up again, this time between the Saudis and Iran. And that conflict between the powerful Saudis, Sunni, and the powerful Iranians, Shia, Saudi Arabs, Iran, Persians, that conflict continues to this day, and we're being dragged in, and we've allowed ourselves to be dragged in on the Saudi side for a whole host of reasons, among others that they produce the oil that we seem most enamored by. So why is it that, and move forward quickly, the old Russia-backed guerrillas broke into two parts, Al-Qaeda, Sunni, and Houthi, who were Shia. And why do I mention Sunni and Shia? It is fundamental to everything that's going on in the Middle East that we understand and remind ourselves every time we hear about a conflict to say, are they Sunni or are they Shia? Those two separate camps of Islamists are intractable foes, and whenever you hear, for example, that Al-Qaeda has established a headquarters in Iran, take it with a grain of salt. Al-Qaeda is Sunni, Iran is Shia. It's not likely to happen. And if we walk that through, what's going on in Iraq, and the resolution of the Iraq war that we so strongly backed is to essentially turn Iraq over to the Shia, Iran-backed majority. In Yemen, the Houthis were the Shia, Al-Qaeda was the Sunni, And Saleh was just a powerful Iranian-backed, to all intents and purposes, dictator. Is to this day. How did we get caught up in this thing? And is it right to be caught up in these local squabbles? In my view is, and certainly from my experience in Central America, if we weren't there supplying the money and supplying the guns and supplying the support, the squabble would disappear. Or one side would win, and I guess that way it would disappear. Does that make sense to all of you? Do you follow that story? So my suggestion is, from a current event standpoint, pay attention to when you hear what are Biden's initial foreign policy steps. Thank you. What are his initial foreign policy steps? The fact that he began in Yemen, I think, is interesting. It's possible the reason he stopped the support in Yemen of Saleh is simply as a first step in renewing Iranian nuclear accord talks. And skeptics can say, since we didn't like the Iranian nuclear accord, we don't want him to stop the pressure on that. Who is the other principal supporter of anything anti-Iran? So they're the big counterweight, but who would support the Saudi fight against Iran other than the United States? Israel. And anything that's perceived to be in favor of Israel, of the largest, most effective lobby organization in this country is the Israel lobby. ACAP, or whatever it is, I think. American Israeli Collective Action, I don't know, I can't remember initials. APAC, thank you. Thank you. I have the P in the C. Political Action Committee. Jacques?
I think the fact that oil is becoming less important may play a part in the action of the United States there, because we don't need Saudi Arabia as much as we used to. Oil is a problem now, not because it's needed, but because we have too much. That's what I meant.
It's a very good point.
I don't know how important it is in that problem that you mentioned, but it's something to think about.
The simple fact is it was hugely important for as long as we were importing most of our oil, or much of our oil. Our relationship with the Saudis was extremely important. And backing the Saudis made a lot of sense if you wanted to maintain that oil dominated economy. Two things have happened. The first is we've found more oil. Fracking, for all its sins, has resulted in energy independence. As a former energy executive, let me tell you, I was wrong so many times forecasting peak oil. We'll never produce as much as we produced yesterday. It's downhill from here on out. Just dead wrong. And with that, and the second thing is there's a global consciousness of a shift away from hydrocarbons. Whether we as the United States buy into it completely or even partially doesn't matter. Globally, that shift is occurring. And as that happens, then we have more and the world is using less. Saudi Arabia becomes less important. So I wonder, why are we stuck in our support for Saudi Arabia, other than being egged on by the Israeli lobby, AIPAC, on one hand, and our own concern about the potential for Iran having a nuclear weapon. Any comments or questions about Mukalla? Good. Let's talk about the Biden beginning, other than that one move that most people don't care about. But I'm asking you, pay attention to that, even if it's not something we care about. By the way, I've discovered, and this might be a more interesting thing, I discovered Yemen on the map because of coffee. Do you all know what Java is? We sometimes call coffee Java, right? Do you know what Mocha is? Mocha is a port in Yemen that used to ship Arabian coffee to Java, a port in Indonesia. Mocha Java, if if you care about coffee, is very important, and thus Yemen. Who knew, right? Biden began with, I heard on Fox last night, 47 executive orders. I think the real number may be slightly lower than that. Google this morning says that some 28 have been signed. I remember counting earlier, Phoebe's here, Carol Lee had that list of executive orders. 17 on day one. I thought it was 10 the next day, which would put us well over 28 by now, because there have been so many more. But the bottom line is there have been a lot. What is your impression of those executive orders? How do you feel about not just the number, but the context? What does this all mean? Forrest, you want to?
I have one thought. Thank you. I have one thought. I would love to ask Biden, tell me how we're going to benefit from going energy independent to energy dependent again. And I think some of his policies may lead us that way.
Could I ask you to rephrase that and say maybe hydrocarbon independent and hydrocarbon dependent as opposed to energy? Because we'll always need energy. The question is where we get it.
You can rephrase it that way if you want to.
Thank you.
That's fine. I still would be interested in the answer.
The answer as to why we want to be hydrocarbon independent? Well, the short answer is that hydrocarbons are warming the environment. That's what his answer would be.
I'm sure.
And a second on that would be, and our history of being dependent upon hydrocarbon-producing countries has not been particularly good.
But doesn't that argue for us being energy independent?
And so our being energy independent with our own hydrocarbon industry makes a lot of sense.
I would think.
But we also have wind and sun.
Sometime.
Well, no, I mean, it's a legitimate question. Don? Microphone?
This is gonna be hard. People.
We're going to get you one of Bobby West's scooters. And then,
Getting back to your concept of the original question about these executive orders, it seems to me that, and this has been going on for a while now, that more and more the executive department is taking over the legislative functions. The president is taking it upon himself, and he can, to do things that really should be going through, or much of it should be going through the legislative function of voting, and this override of the executive activity seems to me maybe in the long term not so good.
I agree. I'm going to come back to the forest issue of the energy. We're going to talk about that a lot in the future, so we're not going to shift. We'll table that and come back to it. I think you're dead right, Don. As much as it's frustrating to watch a Congress that can't seem to get its act together, the reason the Constitution established that arm of government was a good reason, and they're more representative than the dictator at the top, potential dictator.
What? It seems to me that a lot of that attitude has to do with a thing that I've gotten onto lately. The party. The party has become more important than the government. And this emphasis on Democrat, Republican, and shaping the government's activities to fit the party's philosophy rather than the other way around is becoming. And this whole thing of executive action, I think our concept of democracy is going to change, or is changing, unless somebody changes it, or puts the brakes on.
Phoebe, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to know about nuclear power, because you were an executive in power.
So we'll add that to the basket over here of hydrocarbon and energy policy, unlike the conversation about executive orders.
We have a comment here.
Frank?
Bob, I believe we're 80% dependent on fossil fuels for our current needs. It seems to me that the cancellation of the Keystone Pipeline is retribution and not thought out carefully in determining how it's going to affect us economically and the jobs that are going to be lost. As I say, I don't know if it's retribution or if it's good fiscal policy.
So what we'll do is we'll table executive orders and talk a little bit more about energy now, which is fine. I love it. Retribution against whom, Frank?
And the Republicans. The Keystone Pipeline, yes.
No, Trump is a Republican.
Yeah.
But canceling the pipeline again would be,
He brought the pipeline back.
and, you know, and how many of you would tend to agree with that, that it's, that pipeline is a partisan issue? One of the things that troubles me about that, and I respect your opinions, and I think it's important to respect everyone's right to view these things. I'm troubled, and it goes a little bit back to what Don was saying, actually. I don't think hydrocarbons have a political party. They're just, you know, those are just molecules. Kilowatt hours don't have a political party. How did we end up with certain kinds of energy in one camp and other kinds of energy in the other camp? I'm not saying we haven't. I think we clearly have, but it's puzzling to me. Forrest? Sal? Phoebe?
I'm sorry. Bob, I think energy, you could argue, is a neutral, and we all need it of some sort. It might argue about what sort, but there are a lot of politicians made it very political. Al Gore among them, who was riding around in a private G7 and living in a $20,000 home on the coast, 6 feet above sea level, and he said rising sea level is going to kill us all. And then you got John Kerry, who's now, and I hate the term czar. Seems to me it's a little bit Russian, but we got a new climate czar, which is an Obama recapture to me. But it's become very political because of politicians.
I didn't hear anything political in your comments about the G7 and the czar. You know,
Can I say something, please?
Please.
So, also, the question could be, how did a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic that kills people, makes people deathly ill, and has caused us to be isolated as older people in masks and not seeing our families, how in the world did that become political? Things do.
It's just a virus. Sheila?
It made a difference, even though it's just a virus. It just made a difference, even though it's just a virus.
Yeah.
The pandemic.
Yeah. Well, first, let's go over here. Joan? Joan first.
Okay. Today it's tough. Because we have too many people. We need volunteers to run mics. Since when did wearing a mask become political? Excuse me, it's stupid.
I just wanted to talk about what's political and not political that we were talking about here because of oil and fracking, etc. It's, politics is like when you have, you can look at this way or you can turn around the
binoculars
and say the other way, but that's it. And for example, you can take the problem that, sir, that you mentioned and have your saying, and maybe that's good, but then you could have another and say, hey, look, it's obvious that the program of Mr. Biden is in favor of an electricity coming from, let's say, the wind or the sun, and then doing this to hitting a little bit the oil sector means that it's going to help the other one, who is going to, this kind of things, you see, you can go endlessly by throwing a ball and throwing it back, and that's what has been done too much, maybe.
Do you have your hand up back there, Woody, or is that just resting your arm? So the one question, and I think it's something that it will dominate and should dominate, frankly, our discussions forever, and that's why are things partisan? Why can't there just be facts and we deal in facts? The virus is a virus. It's not a red virus or a blue virus. Electrons are just electrons. They're not red or blue. Kilowatt hours and BTUs. You know. But there are one of the reasons. Let me go to Carol first because I don't want to talk too much.
I just talked about executive orders. It just seemed cruel to me that an executive order would close down an industry that so many people were put out of work right now when so many people have lost their jobs and don't have enough money to do, you know, what they need to do at all.
Well, there are two issues there, Carol. One is doing that by executive order, or one is doing it by a congressional act, and those are two separate discussions. Executive orders have become more and more popular because Congress has become more and more stuck. And that's a whole different conversation. What can we do to unstick the Congress? And it's going to be a long slug, I think. Forrest?
This is embarrassing. Bob, I think one of the reasons is that the representative government is less representative because my understanding is that a typical congressperson represents about 700,000 people today. And I've even heard that if we enlarge Congress and have a much closer tie to the populace, that we might have a better feeling about what the mood of the country is. I don't like the idea of more politicians. I would love to see the government decentralized and put it in 4 pods just geographically, and let's see what they could do anything anywhere, because what we're doing right now doesn't work very well. And they spend an awful lot of time raising money just to get reelected.
Yeah, I think there's so many issues there. There's so many issues on the table right now. It's a target-rich environment. Let's prioritize. Can we just talk about energy issues for a second, then put that to bed, and then we'll go to a couple of others, particularly about money in politics and the dysfunctionality of Congress as a result of that, because I think they're terribly linked. That was my industry. My industry was hydrocarbons. Before I did electric power, I did coal, and I love coal. Right? Once you get coal dust under your fingers, it just stays there. I like coal miners, and I like coal mines, and I liked all the things we did. But it's the worst form of energy we have. And I know it, and all the other mine owners know it, whether we're talking about scraping the tops off mountains or moving the coal on trains or trucks or putting miners underground or burning this stuff or getting rid of the ash. It's just not a very good fuel. Thank God we had it, and anybody who says we should never have allowed it to happen is saying we should never have allowed industrialization to happen. We should never have allowed the world's economy to take that rapid escalation up. Coal did that for us. We should be forever grateful, but that doesn't mean we should continue to use it. The 66,000 people who mine coal today could be replaced in a nanosecond by any of the other industries that are about to evolve. Frank, you're right about the hydrocarbon share of energy. I think it's a little less than 80% today. I think my numbers are about 26% renewables, 10 or 12% nuclear, and the rest hydrocarbon. And of that hydrocarbon mix, most is coal. There's just a limited amount of oil and gas. Actually, gas is now increasing its share, so let's say gas and coal. The idea of shifting from again, it shouldn't be partisan, whether hydrocarbon burning warms the atmosphere. It is. How did that happen? I don't know. That should be purely a scientific fact or non-fact. It's either true or it's not true. It's not Republican or Democrat or right-wing or left-wing. but it's become that now, sadly. My understanding, and I say this again from my energy background, is that it's true. Hydrocarbon burning does, in fact, warm the environment, and a shift away from hydrocarbons globally is good. And I say that loving coal and loving natural gas in Pakistan and Bangladesh and everywhere else. That shift, though, to renewable energy sources, I opposed 25 years ago, when it was my business, because the alternatives were so expensive. And most of my work was in poor countries where people couldn't afford any kind of power, much less the most expensive power possible. So when people would tell me, well, why don't you convert that Uganda to wind or solar, I'd say, who's going to pay for it? And until the rich countries of the West are prepared to ante up, we're going to let them find their electricity in the cheapest way they can, even if it is dirty. 25 years on, two things have happened. Renewables are much less expensive than they were then. That's a big change. I've seen studies that say wind power can compete head-on-head with all but the cheapest coal. I don't know if that's totally true, but that's what I've seen the studies. So my answer to that is we should probably, I'm open to conversation, we should probably shift away from hydrocarbons, try to find alternative sources of energy that are comparably priced, because we always need energy. Comments? Frank, again?
Come up with a long-range plan so we take care of the miners in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And liquid natural gas seems to me to be a very clean way to replace coal. But it seems like we think in terms of yesterday, where the Chinese think 100 years from now.
What has been the primary driving force in the process of shifting from coal to natural gas? What's causing that to happen in the United States? Is it government regulation? Is it the war against coal miners?
Yeah, fracking was a problem.
It's called, no, it has nothing to do with politics. Natural gas is cheaper. And it's cheaper because we, through fracking, have uncovered vast quantities of natural gas. Power plants that used to burn coal that have been converted over to natural gas didn't do so because of Obama. Sorry to say it. It just was smart business.
Economics.
It was economics, pure and simple. And that, you can say, well, but wait a minute, what about the long-term plan for the coal miners left behind because gas is cheaper? What about the long-term plan for buggy whip manufacturers? I mean, as technology changes, I don't mean to be facetious about this, technology changes, jobs have to shift. That's the economic growth through deconstruction. Phoebe?
I heard on NPR a program to retrain miners to install and repair windmills, and they love it. They are all great mechanics when they have to run all these little trains and little elevators and then drilling. They're all machines. But they'd much rather be 600 feet above ground than 1,000 feet below.
I was in the
And
coal
they're happy.
business, and I can't put together IKEA furniture. So.
You didn't dig.
As much as certainly we should do job training, and we should do everything we can to help, but you go to those hollows in West Virginia and Kentucky where we worked, and their lifestyles have been like that forever, and that's the reason the hollows are so poor. And retraining those people to a new, we retrained them pretty well in opioid consumption. They're now pretty good at that, sad to say. But whether it's mining or any other industry that's been displaced by technology, sure, job training.
And then you have the CEO of General Motors deciding they are only going to produce electric cars and by 2035.
Yeah.
So that's not a government policy. This is a business policy. They
Well,
see
it's a
what the
business.
people want.
In fairness, it's a business policy in anticipation of government regulations that are going to outlaw gas-fired vehicles. But there you can say every gas station could be converted to a recharging station, and you could, and we will do. I mean, that displacement will occur that way. Do we want to talk more about the energy thing, Frank, or you?
You would know better than I, Bob.
Natural gas, the thing of the future?
Well, LNG is LNG is natural gas compressed down to be shipped as a liquid and then regassed across the way. In this country, we have pipelines to move natural gas in gaseous state throughout the country. So do I think that natural gas is a better fuel than coal and fuel oil? Sure. It's cleaner, easier to use, period. And LNG is a way to export gaseous natural gas to other countries. So the idea of having LNG ports here to liquefy the gas on this side of the water, ship it in containers to the other side of the water, then regas there, it makes a lot of sense.
Isn't that one of the missions of the Keystone Pipeline?
No, the Keystone Pipeline was moving liquids, dirty oil, down to the northern state refinery area, where that would be then further refined into various oil products. That's my understanding. Is that yours, Bob? I'm sorry?
Alberta shale oil.
Yeah, and that shale oil is a heavy, tarry stuff.
And hard to refine.
And it's hard to refine, hard to move. I personally was kind of a fan of Keystone Pipeline. I didn't see why it mattered so much, but I know environmentalists were saying that it, number one, perpetuated a hydrocarbon dependence, and number two, violated certain landowners' rights. Everything I've owned, I just really hope to be violated and have somebody run a pipeline through. Never happened.
The Indian reservations thought it was important.
And I think and I respect that,
Yeah.
For whatever reason. Any other comments?
One more.
Don?
Yeah. If we didn't take land by eminent domain, where would we be?
Exactly.
Oh, I thought you were opposing eminent domain.
No.
because
I was opposing the fact that I've never owned a piece of property anyone wanted to take by eminent domain.
But it happens all the time.
But he'd like that to happen.
Yeah, I wanted them to have a freeway go right through my farm. Actually, I knew somebody, I will come back, sorry. We had a friend in southern Texas who said he was a rancher, but the ranching was so tough down his part of Texas. I said, why is that? And he said, well, you have these 36-inch pipelines crisscrossing our land. I said, well, that's really tough. I mean, all you have is, gajillion gallons of gas and oil, so you can't farm. Carol?
I'm just curious, and I've never understood, where is all the fuel going to come from that's going to fuel all these electric cars?
Well, it's electricity, and it's going to come from power plants, and the power plants are going to be making that electricity from the mix that Frank talked about. Now, let's call it 60% hydrocarbon, 10% nuke, and 20% renewables. And until that mix shifts down to lower and lower and lower hydrocarbon content, that energy is going to come from hydrocarbons. It's as simple as that. I've always said, gee, this idea of shifting the cars to not use hydrocarbons, if you're going to make the electricity with hydrocarbon fuel, is senseless. But that's the goal. And the goal is to increasingly find alternative ways to make electricity. And what's arguably one of the cheapest ways? It's wind. I've been told from wind power friends that enough wind blows every day along the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains from Canada all the way down to Mexico to supply the energy needs of the United States 2 or 3 times over. The trick is to capture that energy and then move it on transmission lines to the places that need it. Some other hands were up. Don?
Bob, I hope you're here 20 years from now because we'll be discussing hydrogen and fusion. This is where we're going to be going, and we're working on this now.
And I couldn't agree more. And that'll put windmills out of business.
Exactly.
That's-
This is a progressive.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So is one of the issues change, which we all have difficulty with change, and trust. Maybe human beings have to learn to trust one another, especially in the process of change.
That's tough. That's tough. That's tough getting human beings to trust one another.
How many of you know the name Steven Pinker? Anybody? Pinker, Pinker. I'm going to highly recommend that, there are two things I'm going to suggest we do as we come to a close today. Steven Pinker is I'm sorry for this, a Harvard professor, teaches psychology, but he's written two books that are fascinating about on the subject really of change, long-term global change. One of them is called Better Angels of Our Nature. That was the first book. And the other is more recently, no, that's a different guy. It'll come to me and I'll email it out. But his research, which is just phenomenal, shows the declining level of violence in the world. And you say, well, wait a minute, we're having more wars now, and they're shooting people up the gazoo in Chicago. How can that be? The data is really good. That over the last, since the beginning of recorded history, deaths per 100,000 population from violence have gone down. Infant mortality has gone down. Lifespans have gone up. Progress, believe it or not, as a result of all of these changes that we're talking about, has been phenomenal, inexorable, and beneficial. We are really living today longer, better lives because of the changes that have occurred over the last millennia. It's a counterintuitive book, but I recommend it. Charles?
If that's the case, then why are we making such a big deal about violence today? It's happening.
Still happening.
It's still happening, and
We need to continue to make a big deal, Charles.
say that again.
We need to continue to make a big deal when it comes to violence. Any violence is not really beneficial, right?
Well, this is going to sound weird, but violence is a way of life. As long as people are looking to gain something in their life, improve themselves, or even get power, there's always going to be violence involved. I mean, it's a good wish, but based on history, I don't see it being something that's achievable.
I'll come back to that. I've got a good answer. Forrest?
We have 1 year, just for running purposes.
Don?
We're talking change. There's a quote from Stephen Hawkins: intelligence is the ability to accept change.
I like that. Forrest?
Bob, I have two comments. One,
Can you all hear a duck? Good.
first comment is your point about things getting better. There's a book I read about 1982 or 3 called Things Get Better and Better All the Time by Stephen Moore, who's still around, used to be head of the Club for Growth, and Jerome Simon. But they wrote this book, and they used statistics from 1900, 1950, 1980, and 100 different criteria from childbirth weight to you name it, education levels, whatever. Every single one of those things 50 years later and a subsequent 30 years later was better every single time. So that's a very optimistic thought. And the second thing I would say is a book called Future Shock, written several years back by the Toffler man and wife, about the rate of change. It's changing at an increasingly greater rate, and expect even more at a faster rate.
And expect it to be, on the whole, beneficial change.
Absolutely.
Yeah, again, Steven Pinker. I'll send out the names of the books and the where you can get them. But the short answer to Charles' questions is, we shouldn't be as panicked about violence today as we are. We should lament every death, but we should recognize and applaud the progress we've made in reducing death. That doesn't mean we stop making progress. We shouldn't disband public health because we've been so successful. We should say, hey, it works.
I would agree with you, and we were talking about public health. How can you argue with anything that improves health? It's not bad, it's good, it's great. I'm talking about the other kinds of violence, the things that happen to people all the time, and we've continued to have it. I'm trying not to be a pessimist about it, but I think it is in human nature.
If I use the word herd cull, how many of you know that concept? To me, one can say, why do we have disarmament talks? Violence is going down, and violence will always be here. Why should we meet with our enemies to talk about disarmament? To me, it's a no-brainer. Violence is getting less and less and less because we talk about disarmament, because we try to better police and make our neighborhoods safer.
Yes, I would like to give a good example of what you say. The European Union, which has been created not as many people think, to have a huge market. That came too, but the first initial inspiration was to peace, and peace essentially between France and Germany, and we had peace between France and Germany. And if you count the number of people in your statistics that you mentioned, and count the number of dead people that represent the two first and second wars, that's enormous amount of people. So if it enters into your statistic, I think that's likely whatever happened in our streets, which is a different kind of violence, and a kind of way of speaking to each other, which is a kind of verbal violence, etc., etc. Yes, well, it is the way that then violence is certainly reduced today compared in the past. And
I love that. I'll just say before we let Neil comment that violence with a French accent doesn't sound so tough.
That is true.
A short comment on violence. We need leaders who do not incite violence.
Couldn't agree more.
Go back to Hitler, Stalin, etc. They encouraged violence to their own political ends. We don't need that.
And I think about, and again, it's in my mind, it inspires me to support more and more efforts to reduce violence. I think about Xi and what he's doing and what we can do to engage with China to reduce the violence that I think he's perpetrating on the Uyghurs and potentially in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Look at Myanmar. What's her name? Aung San Suu Kyi, I can never say that correctly, has been put back in detention by the military, who staged a coup, 5 days ago. And what they've done to the Rohingya is just mind-boggling. Why do we allow that to happen, and why can't we continue to work toward reducing it? It's now time. One more comment. Bud, is it?
Yes, but I just had a comment on what Forrest gave out. If anybody is interested in a interesting example of GameStop, watch Trading Places with Eddie Murphy.
Oh, yes. I love it. I love it.
Good idea.
Next Friday at 10 a.m., we're going to have tables organized such that we can have table talk. The rules are going to be simple. You'll sit in a group of 6. I encourage mixing with left and right if you can find those, and select a table leader, and we'll come up with a topic next week. I'm open to any suggestions for topics to talk about, so please email them in. No, we'll do it right here. We'll just put, we have,
Well,
we'll put tables together. And I've even had these things with pretend tables. I've had tea parties with pretend tea. Thank you all very much. I'm sorry, Joan, you have one more?
Are you gonna make these table mixes random?
Yeah. Well, I guess we can make them random, but I'd much prefer for you just to sit randomly where you want to sit.
People, then you
Yeah.
slide in and get clicked on.
Appreciate you.
Or we could get some help, as Forrest would suggest, from the federal government. They could come up with guidelines and some regulations. Remember to leave your email addresses, okay? You got them? Excellent. Thank you very much.